We are going to start with our handmade paper demonstration, where I'll show you how to cast different types of fibers into various molds. I'll show you how to dredge window screen and cheesecloth through handmade paper pulp to create some sheets, as well as different types of lacing techniques. I'm going to show you how to laminate different types of fibers together to create a ground, a textural ground that you can work from. And all of these different techniques and processes can be used in conjunction with the materials that you have on hand to allow for a dynamic and textural composition in the end. Okay, so let's get started with our first process, which is going to be prepping our fibers. So I have a couple water baths over here, just some containers that I had around, things from the kitchen, a paint container, and then a larger Rubbermaid container full of water and cardboard. I've got a couple pieces of fabric in here also soaking. So I like to use wet fibers when I work because the glue that we're going to use, whether it be methyl cellulose, wood glue, Elmer's, or any of the glues from the recipes that I sent along to you guys that you can make from flour and cornstarch, those are going to soak into your fibers a little bit better if they are pre-soaked. You can use warm water to speed up the process a little bit. All right, so first things first, let's talk about our castings. So we've got multiple different types of castings that you can do. And here are just some examples for you. Some of you may have seen me do a couple of them during class before spring break. Okay, when you're casting, something to keep in mind is that you want your mold to be as flexible as possible, similar to this thin piece of plastic. Okay, this was an old beading container, but because it's flexible, it allows me, when I start to peel away the dry material, it allows me to work both ways. So if this was rigid, I'd only be able to pull at my paper. But because this is foam, I can then push away at the foam. And if my paper is just a little bit more fragile, the foam is going to allow me a little bit more wiggle room to peel my paper out and still keep the majority of the form that I have. And you'll notice my paper is just still a little bit wet on the underside, and I like to get it out of my form while it's still a little bit wet, because then I can use its pliability to my advantage and reshape it a little bit after it's out. So this piece, you'll notice I decided to leave some negative space in my mold because I liked this edge on the paper here. This piece, I did a little bit more of the mold in its entirety, and you can go either way with that. So let's just do a really quick demonstration of how to apply fibers into your mold, both fabric and paper fibers. Okay, you can use cardboard, you can use paper towels, you can use any papers that you have on hand, any of your sort of fancier papers, mulberry, that you can buy at the store if you would like to. You're welcome to do that. You can also use any leaves or floral elements that you can find on hand, and you can kind of treat this as a collage in and of itself. So what I want to make sure that I do is not apply glue toward the surface of my mold. So I'm going to go to my water bath here, grab my cardboard that's been soaking for a while, and I'll try to use this as my base layer here and just kind of fold it into my mold. Plastic molds are great because they're non-porous, the water won't soak in, and the methyl cellulose or your glue won't soak in. So again, I'm sort of treating this as a little bit of a collage in and of itself, choosing papers and putting them together in specific compositions. So I'm both playing here and being conscious of my compositional decision making. Okay, so anywhere I have my paper overlapping itself, I want to just put a little bit of glue on there. And I can peel it back gently, go back underneath. Okay, so that's our idea. And then once I have my base ground, I can be a little bit more liberal with my glue. I'm working over top of a piece of plastic wrap here just to keep my countertop nice and clean. So I might go in and apply glue to this netting material all the way across the back of it. And we'll speed up here to keep the video as brief as possible, and you can watch what I'm doing and how I'm working as I go. So I could keep going for a while here, collaging wet elements on top of wet elements, and responding to the shape and the form of my mold as I go. So you can treat this as similar to your dry collaging techniques, you're just working wet. And so once I'm finished, what I want to do is take my paste and just put a nice thin layer over the top of the entire collage here. And we want to be using a paste that is a little bit more transparent in this case. This is just going to seal it for me and help it to retain some of its structural integrity as it dries and allow me to peel it out of the form really nicely. And just making sure, double checking that all of those fibers are stuck together. So this is one way to work in a mold. The other way to work is to use your mold just to produce a ground. So you use one material, you take your casting out of its mold, and then I can work dry, as we've done in the past throughout the semester, onto this ground. The one thing you want to make sure of if you decide to work this way is that you want to have enough layers built up. You kind of see through there, right? In some places, and in other places you can see that I've got some more body, some more structure. I've layered up 5 to 6 layers of my paper towel just to make sure that as I keep working, the piece is going to be structurally sound enough for me to add glue, maybe do some decollage, peel some things back off if I don't like them, sew through it, and make sure that it's nice and robust, okay? So just make sure you have enough layers if you decide to work dry. Next thing I'd like to talk about is some more, a little bit more traditional handmade paper techniques. And again, we don't have our professional decal boxes on hand. We're at home, so we need to use what we have around us. So in this case, you can use things like cheesecloth. Some of you might even have this in your kitchens already. This is a great material to use to create handmade paper at home. You can also use window screening. So if you have any extra window screens around that are just going to get thrown out, you can go ahead and cut out a square for yourself, and that will help you dredge, that will help you drain your paper as you go. okay? As far as pulp goes, toilet paper and tissue paper are really great. You can just start soaking those in a warm water bath, and if you let them soak for a good amount of time, they'll start to break down and get really nice and soft for you. And this is a great way to use refuse materials, what you have on hand, to create some really interesting pieces of paper. You can also purchase handmade paper pulp, okay, at art stores, or you can purchase it online at Carriage House Papers or Twin Rocker Papers if you want to go down that road, but you don't have to. So if I decide to use my toilet paper, there's a couple of different things that I can do with it. So I could create just a normal sheet of paper by taking my cheesecloth. I could dredge it through my paper pulp, and the sheet here is going to pick up my pulp, and then I'll set it down and I'll sponge it off, and it'll be a very interesting sort of topographic piece of paper for me. Okay? Other ways you can work on your window screen, and in this case when you're using the hot glue, it's important that you use metal screening as opposed to this polymer plastic screening, because the plastic screening will just melt under the heat of the hot glue gun. Okay? So this is going to be similar to our calligraphic processes that we did the week before spring break, except I'm going to make an embossed piece of paper over the top of this. Okay, so I could dredge through, and I'll show you the dredging. And this is going to be pretty rudimentary. This is not how you would make a very professional, traditional sheet of handmade paper. Okay, the processes are fairly similar, but this is much more bulky, much more rudimentary. So I can dredge and just pick up my pieces of paper here, and I'm pretty wet here, so I'm dripping and hanging off the edge, so I just want to make sure that I pick up any excess material. And then I've got my towel here ready and waiting for me, which I like to have on hand. And I might just adjust my fibers a little bit and add where I didn't quite pick up enough. So this is not going to be the perfect sheet of paper, but it will function similarly to some of the thicker handmade papers that we've been using, ordered from Blick. So once I have the look that I want, and I can go pretty lacy with this. You can see over here, I've done that. I've gone a little bit more lacy and left some more negative space in here on my cheesecloth. So you can actually place your pulp in any orientation that you want. And that freedom is kind of liberating as well. If I'm working a thicker, more uniform sheet, I like to put a piece of screen over the top as I do my rudimentary couching here, which is basically just pressing down and allowing the water to recede into the towel. And I can use a sponge. And if the sponge gets too wet, I'll just wring it out into my paper pulp. The reason we use the screen over top is so that the sponge fibers don't stick to the paper fibers. So then I'm left with a pretty flat piece of paper here that when I peel it off later, you can kind of see the hot glue here. When I peel it off later, it's going to be left with these peaks and valleys where the hot glue was adhered to the screen. Okay, so that's going to be a little bit of an embossing effect. Let me see if I can peel it off right now. So this piece of paper happens to be thick enough, I got enough fiber on here to be able to peel it off right away, okay? And you can sort of see a little bit of textural element there. So you do need to let this dry as much as you can if you want to retain that embossed effect. I could now, if I wanted to be really, really gentle, or if I wanted to cast over the surface of something like a bowl, I could pick this up and lay it over top of another surface. and then I could end up casting over that surface, okay? But for now, I'm gonna put it on my window screen and I'm just gonna lay it to the side, okay? And you can see once I've pressed down on the fibers, they interlock and they become a lot stronger. If you want a little bit more of a uniform effect as opposed to this really thin transparent area and the more opaque white areas, you can put your paper pulp through a blender or a food processor, and that's going to make it a lot smoother for you, sort of a creamy-like texture, a little bit more like a buttermilk texture, and then you'll be able to dredge a lot more easily. One more thing I'd like to show you with our handmade paper is enclosing images or different types of materials or fibers into your paper. So here I've got a couple examples. I have some wire that comes out from the surface and then goes back underneath into the surface of the paper. So if you want to work like this is a great way to add some dimension to your pieces, because once the piece is dry, you can actually bend your wire and have your paper hold a specific shape. So if I wanted to enclose in wire, as I showed you in that piece, what I would just do is put a little bit of my pulp down. And here I'm just going to work directly on my towel so it absorbs. So press down, make sure it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to put my wire right on through. I'm going to try to go pretty flat so the paper pulp will sit around the fiber, whether it's wire or fabric. I can crisscross here. If you're going to use wire, just be aware that it will rust on you. So the rust will come through the paper pulp as it dries. And then I'll just lay some more pulp over the surface of my wires. I'll press. And show you a couple more embeddings with different materials. So you saw me embed both natural elements, some Formica chips, birch bark, an image from a magazine fabric and string or yarn and wire. So you might have noticed as I was working, if there were elements that I wanted to leave unenclosed in the paper, I added just a little bit of methyl cellulose on the top to help the pieces stick together after and as they dry, okay? So again, you can work wet like this, as we did with our molds earlier. You can make small components, as I've done here, or you could use a larger sheet of screening, and you could work wet with your collage for a very long time with the methyl cellulose, working back and forth, enclosing different images, different materials within your paper, letting it dry, then going back in and scratching off the surface of the paper and adding more elements. Last thing I'd like to talk with you about, which is tangential to what we've been doing so far, is the lamination of different types of materials. So we don't need to just think of handmade paper as being the natural or normal pulp that we think about in our printer paper, our sketchbook paper, things like that. We can think about handmade paper as also being things that enclose natural elements, or the lamination of leaves or birch bark. Even fabrics you can laminate together and make a very, very interesting textural ground. So this lamination I started just a little while ago, and I used leaves that had been soaked in a warm water bath, so they're nice and pliable for me. I used my methyl cellulose Elmer's glue mixture, and you can see as I peel it up, it's still wet underneath where it has been contacting the plastic wrap, but peeling it up while it's dry on the top and wet on the bottom allows me a little bit more flexibility, and then I can go back in, and if I don't like how the glue has pooled here, I'm just going to go back in and give it a little dab with my sponge. And usually when you do laminations against plastic wrap, the side that was down is going to have a little bit of a gloss to it, just because of how the glue sits up against the plastic wrap, okay? So you can laminate any sort of planar or flat material like this together. So different types of laminating. Fabric with a little bit more of a textural element in the center where I use just a touch more glue, and pretty flat lamination with natural fibers and objects. So last thing I want to do is just show you really quickly some examples of combined processes. Back to the encapsulated image here inside a piece of paper. This was a larger piece of window screen with magazine printout images encapsulated. This piece combines sewing, which we're going to be talking about in more depth in the coming weeks, but you're welcome to experiment with it right now, and multiple layering of dried handmade paper with textural elements, natural elements encapsulated within the paper. So that's a little bit more of a structural collage, a little bit more three-dimensional that stands up on a table. Here's another example of this lamination process. This is money plant that has just been laminated. The seed pods have been laminated one on top of the other with our methyl cellulose, and some old fibers found from inside of a couch. The two forms were cast around a balloon and then put together, wet so that they started to curl and interact with one another. So think about how maybe some of these different processes can work together and how you can change and alter your materials even after they have dried. Last but not least, here is a cast of with a figurative element. So this was cast around a mannequin. So think creatively about what you have around the house, interesting objects that you can cast your paper around. Again, the less porous the surface is, the better, because if the water and the glue soak in, it's going to be much harder to take your cast off of the object that you had cast onto. And you can use wire components on the inside, paper stretched over the wire, wrapped around, glued to itself in conjunction with a different type of paper with its figurative element that sits on the top.